You're in the water loop.
Water loop, water loop, water loop.
Hey everyone, this is Travis with Waterloop. I want to tell you about the Flume smart water monitor that I use at my house. Flume is the perfect device for tracking your water usage in real time with your smartphone. You can see exactly how much water you're using with showers, toilets, sinks, appliances, outside irrigation, any way you use water. Flume lets you set daily, weekly, and monthly water budgets. It also alerts you if there's excessive water use and if it detects a leak. In fact, right when I hooked up Flume at my house, it alerted me of a leak. I was losing a gallon of water every 6 minutes outside of my water line. Turns out it had been there for months, and I was wasting ridiculous amounts of water and money. I'm not sure when I would have found that without Flume. Flume is super easy to install. You wrap a band around your water meter, just like you put a watch on your wrist. Connect to Wi-Fi, download the app, and you're all set. No plumber needed. Now you can use promo code WATERLOOP to save 15% off of Flume at flumetech.com. With Flume, you'll never be surprised by a water bill again.
Water loop, water loop, water loop.
Welcome to Waterloop. This is Travis. Very excited to be joined by my old friend and colleague, Micah Ragland. How's it going, Micah?
I'm good, Travis. Thanks for having me on, brother. I appreciate it.
Yeah, totally. So just for people's background, we were at EPA together for several years. The end of the Obama administration, right? I'm not sure how many
That's
years
right.
you were there. I was the director of communications for the Office of Water for like 6 years, and you were in the public engagement and outreach guy.
That's right. I think I overlapped with you for about 4 years there. I was there from 13 to 17.
Man, we were just so busy and having so much fun. That 4 years flew by.
It definitely did, brother.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, we'll talk a little bit about EPA in a while, but I really wanted to connect with you to talk about Flint. Like I mentioned off air, it's been a highly publicized issue and topic and situation. There's been a lot of people giving their opinions, weighing in as experts, all that good stuff. But I wanted to connect with you because you're from Flint.
I am.
And I want to hear about that, about the place, and then we'll talk about your experiences going back there. But yeah, could you talk first about just being from Flint?
Yeah. Well, I'm a proud Flintstone. That's what folks from Flint call ourselves. I'm actually a fifth generation Flintstone. My great grandparents moved to Flint in the late 50s, early 60s, along with my grandparents. And so, and 7 generations total of my family.
Okay.
And so it's a place where I was born, where I was raised, and I still have close to 30 relatives who actually live within the city limits of Flint itself, mostly on the north side of town. And it's just a place that's always been near and dear to my heart. It's a place that I thoroughly enjoyed growing up. I grew up there in the late 70s through the 80s, and it was and still remains a place where people just have a high sense of pride. It's a blue collar community, and not a lot of folks know, but GM was actually founded in Flint, and the UAW actually held their first walkout and strike in Flint. And
Wow.
so, it's an area that has traditionally a pretty strong manufacturing background, blue collar community, strong represented union labor workforce there. And was just really a fun place to grow up when I was growing up there in the 70s and 80s. And of course, they've had challenges going up to, the last probably 3 to 4, if not 5 decades. But it's a community that's very, very tight knit and very resilient as well.
Yeah. I think I first heard that term Flintstones maybe watching like Michigan State basketball.
That's right. Yeah,
And
yeah,
like Mateen Cleaves is one guy that jumps out in my mind.
yeah, yeah.
Is that right? He's a
That's right.
Flint
Yeah,
kid?
Mateen.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
Mateen's a Flintstone, and he's still heavily involved in the community there. Maurice Peterson was also on that team that won that national championship. I think they won it in 2000, and they had I think 4 of their 5 starters from that team were from Flint. So it great athletic tradition there. The Flintstones from Michigan State are from the area. Glenn Rice is from the area. A famed
Yeah.
player. Played on the national championship team at the University of Michigan when they won it back in, I believe, 1988. And you have some other folks from there. Super Bowl champion Carl Banks is from Flint. Clarissa Fields, current, I want to say heavyweight boxing champion in the women's field is from Flint, and she's heavily involved in the community there. So it's definitely a place where we put a lot of pride in athletics, and we're very proud of folks who make it out and perform at such a high level. And it's been going on for generations. My father actually was a collegiate football player, and he actually played competitively with the Risen family. They're also
Okay. Like
yeah.
Like Andre Rison? Yeah.
Yeah, so he's So he actually he and Andre Risen's uncle Mo Risen actually played high school football together, and Mo Risen was a phenomenal athlete, as was his nephew Andre, and now Andre's son is on the rise as well, and making a name for himself. So it's definitely one of those places where you have a lot of pride in terms of of the athletes who come out. And one thing that I've always really enjoyed, especially growing up in Flint, in the summer times, there are just so many professional athletes from the NFL, NBA. We even had a few folks who made it to the MLB ranks, who would just always make it a point to come back to the community, invest in the community, not just with charity, but also with their time. I have just a ton of memories as a kid growing up, and going to Glenn Rice's basketball camp and things of that nature, and it's just a lot of good memories.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so what's the population of Flint, or what kind of was it at that time? Because it's not a big place, so you have these premier athletes, big name athletes come back, and I could see how they're just part of the community then, and just kind of out on the street, if you will.
Yeah. It's a pretty small community. I think when I was growing up there in the 70s and 80s, it probably had a population anywhere in the 130 to 140 range. It's sadly enough, Flint is actually one of the fastest shrinking metropolitan areas in the country, and of course, they've had a lot of hardships the last few decades with starting in the 60s and 70s with GM doing some of their restructuring and moving a large portion of their manufacturing base actually out of Flint into other states and even into other countries. So, that's contributed. They've had some other woes that they've had to deal with a shrinking tax base that's really limited the local government's ability at times to serve the constituency. And so when I was growing up there, it's probably, 130, 140, 150. But right now, I think the population's hovering somewhere in the high 80,000 range, maybe low 80,000 range. Yeah. And at its peak, when my grandparents and great grandparents, first moved there, nearly 6-7 decades ago, at its peak, it had a population of over 200,000. So that just kind of gives you context, within, 3 to 4 generations of just how much the city has unfortunately contracted from a population standpoint.
Yeah. And so, all this is going on over time as the population's shrinking, and they've gone through different hardships and losing jobs and companies and all this kind of thing. And then, I think it's almost a common phrase now. Flint happened, right? That's what people say
Right.
outside of
Yeah.
that area, referring to the terrible drinking water crisis with lead.
Yeah.
And for people, what did you hear when this happened?
Yeah.
When the news hit, what was the news, and how did that affect you? What was
Yeah.
going on?
Yeah, it was a really interesting time. One thing that I always remember about the onset um, of the crisis was there was a little bit of a prelude to it at the grassroots level. They initially made the switch for years. I want to say over 50 years. Flint had been sourcing its water from Detroit's municipal water system, and which has one of the cleanest and efficient water systems in the country. And in April of 2014, because the city was on the prelude of bankruptcy and actually had fallen into receivership, the state appointed an emergency manager. The emergency manager came in with a mandate to cut the city's spending with the goal of balancing their budget and switching the water system from Detroit over to Flint's own municipal system was one of the cost saving measures. And I remember in the lead up to that, there were several conversations. The emergency manager that the state appointed was holding city council meetings, and it just wasn't elected officials on the city council and then the then mayor. And others who had some concerns about this, but it was residents themselves. I think I think a lot of people outside of Michigan take for granted just how prideful Michiganders are about their water. We have a lot of lakes here. It's a big part of not only our summer recreation, but our winter recreation. And so I think, on an average, residents here in Michigan have a little bit of a higher aptitude and understanding of water, water safety, and then just the overall role that water plays in our lives, not just from a vitality standpoint, but just also from a recreational standpoint as well. So in the lead up to that, I would have residents, I would have some of my friends that I grew up with, and some of my cousins, text me and just randomly call me and say, hey, they're talking about switching our water system from Detroit to Flint. And that would be horrible.
And this was happening. You were at EPA at that time. I just want to make that point. So
yeah.
you're living in DC, and you're helping EPA with public outreach and public engagement on environmental and public health protection measures. And so
That's right.
You're starting to hear about this with that context.
Yeah, and so it was kind of like a little bit of a slow trickle up until they made the switch. And like I said, I had folks reaching out to me expressing concern about it. And I think one of the things, Travis, that I think really gave people angst. And as I don't have a scientific background. Most of my career I've spent doing, public outreach and community organizing, but one of the things that gave people a lot of angst is traditionally the Flint River, which flows through Flint and other communities throughout Genesee County, which is the county that Flint is based in, has been used for industrial purposes, and it doesn't have the best reputation for having the cleanest water. As a matter of fact, when you fish on the river, at least it was this way when I was growing up as a kid, you would see signs that would say, it's fine to fish, but, there would be recommendations of not taking the fish home and cooking them and consuming them. And so, you have residents hearing, well, you're going from water be sourced from Port Huron, which is one of the cleanest freshwater systems in the world, to the Flint River, which has, just a horrible reputation in terms of, being associated with industrial waste, not being clean, and not even being safe to really fish out of. And so, residents and a lot of my family members immediately got upset. So for me, when the switch happened, for me, it kind of happened in two phases. One was the lead up, where people were kind of reaching out to me and saying, hey, they're thinking about doing this. So this would be crazy. And then when it actually happened, And then you had the immediate occurrences with, people having, water that had bad odors, that were discolored and things of that nature. And so for me, it was kind of like a double whammy in those initial phases when the crisis first happened.
Mm. And so then, once the switch was made and lead started finding its way into people's homes and into people's water and into their bodies, what are you hearing? Obviously, the news starts exploding across the country and stuff.
Yeah.
A lot of people saw those stories, but what are you hearing, firsthand from family and friends there?
Yeah, there are three stories that stick out to me in terms of what I was, in terms of what I remember. They made the switch in April of 2014, and then around May or June, I started getting messages from family members. Some of my cousins were reaching out to me and saying, hey, my water still is fine, but I was just talking to one of my neighbors down the street, and they're saying it's discolored, and it's this and it's that. It has a weird odor to it, and kind of like asking me for guidance on advice that they could give their neighbors on what to do. And of course I said, hey, look, the state, Department of Natural Resources or Environmental Protection in Michigan, they have, primary jurisdiction over that. Make sure you pass that along to your neighbors and have them trickle that up. So that was kind of like the second phase kind of turned to it's spreading. And then my relatives coming to me and say, well, actually I'm having that problem now.
Wow.
Actually, discoloration in my water, it doesn't smell right. And I'm concerned about using it. And then it kind of just, over the next several weeks and months, just kind of blew up into something that was more widespread, unfortunately, and something that started to catch the attention of, not just local media in that mid-Michigan market in Flint, but around the state, and then eventually around the country. And so for me, it was just kind of one of those gradual trickles of things where relatives were reaching out to express concern for their neighbors, and they were reaching out to kind of express concerns for their own health and asking for advice on how to safeguard themselves. And as they were doing that, simultaneously, others in the community were experiencing, unfortunately, those same hardships. And the story really picked up and took off. One of the things, I want to flag, Travis, that actually one of the biggest travesties that came out of the Flint water crisis is that, that outcry for help and assistance and for attention to the issue, it actually took, up to a year and a half for it really to get on the national radar. Like I said, they made the switch in April of 2014. But the state of Michigan did not declare a state of emergency until almost a year and a half later in the fall of 2015. And once the state declared its state of emergency, is when, it started getting more national attention. Celebrities were coming to Flint with, donations of bottled water and other necessities. And then after that, the federal government, as is tradition, normally the state has to declare emergency first, or at least the feds tend to defer to the state and declare emergency first, and then the feds will, supplement that with their own. But the fact that it took the state a year and a half to declare a state of emergency, I think is one of the biggest travesties that's come out of this, that, for up to, 16 to 18 months, people were, not only having to deal with this water, but they essentially felt like they weren't having their concerns addressed in a timely fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think one of the worst elements of the whole story too is the kids, right? And children that are 6 and under, I think, are the most susceptible to the harmful impacts of lead, especially on their neurological development and all that stuff. And the fact that they were subjected to lead for that long before, the sirens really went off. It's heartbreaking,
It really is. It really is. I mean, and to your point, I mean, children under the age of 6 were at risk. There were pregnant women who are at risk. Unfortunately, I had a friend who was a dear family friend who was pregnant at the time, and unfortunately, she miscarried during that time. A lot of people don't know, but Flint has a very high senior population. One of the things that has happened over probably at least the last 2 to 3 decades is as the economic situation in Flint has worsened, what's happening is you're having families, and my family is probably an example. There were 4 generations of my family that lived in Flint before I was born, and because there just wasn't a lot of economic opportunity as I was leaving high school and going to college, I didn't return to the city. But my parents stayed, my grandparents stayed, and my great grandparents stayed, and that's what's happening with other families in Flint too, is where the older generations are remaining there, but the younger generations are leaving, and so you have this disproportionate amount of our high number of seniors who live in the city. And so, you have seniors who are vulnerable, you have, children under the age of 6, and women who are pregnant and nursing who are populations who were unfortunately adversely impacted by this. And those impacts are still being realized today. The New York Times came out with a great piece. I want to say it was in October or November of this year. And it was just talking about, since the 5 years, now going on 6 years, since the crisis, how the city of Flint and the county of Genesee County, where Flint is located, has seen a huge spike in the number of special needs children in their education system, and a lot of it's being attributed to the impacts that lead had on these children. Starting back with the crisis in 2014.
Yeah. So this is unfolding. It's hitting national news. EPA at the federal level, from DC, is starting to turn its attention to this and get involved in the situation. I know EPA is sending, officials and staff, regional folks, people from DC up there. At what point do you go to Flint, and what role do you take, and what's that like, being from there, but being, sent by your employer, by the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, to be part of the response?
Yeah. It was something that I really had a lot of mixed emotions about. The state of Michigan declared their state of emergency, like I said, somewhere around October and November of 2015, so year and a half after the crisis happened. And then President Obama issued the federal state of emergency in January of 2016. And so as soon as he declared his state of emergency, the federal government organized and sent resources to Flint to help the city recover, with the goal of getting their water system back to normal. One of the things that I was charged with when I went there was, and I had no idea it was going to turn into the long-term project that it did, but one of the things our former boss, Gina McCarthy, who headed up the agency for most of the time that you and I were there, asked me to do, since I was from there, was to just go and do an assessment and see if, in fact, information was being communicated at a grassroots level, not only that people were being touched at a grassroots level, but they were getting information in a way that they could digest it and understand it, and then act on in a way that would safeguard their health. And so when I first went up to Flint in January of 16, right after the declaration was, the federal emergency declaration was declared, and I did an assessment. And I met with a few nonprofits who are on the ground and a few other organizing agencies. And there was actually a good infrastructure that existed in the city in terms of, folks knocking on doors, getting out in the community and things of that nature. but there were some things that I noticed with the community organizing and outreach that I felt like the federal government could assist with. And one was getting information to those groups to pass out to their networks, and then also coordinating with them from a cross-sectional standpoint of when they are going out in community and canvassing the communities, like having an EPA representative with them or someone from the federal government there with them to help residents as they're looking to have some of their questions answered on how to navigate the system in terms of getting assistance, and then more importantly, how they can safeguard themselves. And so initially, I thought this assessment was only going to take, like 2 to 3 weeks. And, I kind of swoop in, we figure it out, and we would work it from there. And then, I would leave and go back to DC. But as we got on the ground, we just saw that the need was a lot more severe than we originally anticipated. One of the stories that I always tell is that when I first got on the ground in January and February of 16, we were already a year and a half into the crisis. And so I was under the assumption that every family in Flint knew that it was not safe to drink unfiltered tap water, just because, it'd been on the local news and the national news, and you have all this activity happening in the city. To me, I just felt like, it would be impossible not to know that. But one of the first canvassing trips that I took with a group that was organizing and literally just going door to door, knocking on doors, asking residents if they were okay, asking them if they had questions about the crisis, and then giving them advice on how to safeguard themselves. And then if they needed assistance, also working with them to make sure that they got connected with the appropriate agencies. And about a week or two before I started canvassing, the group that I was canvassing with, they had been out in the field a few weeks prior to me getting there. And they told me a story about how they knocked on a family's door on the east side of town. And on the east side of Flint, you have a relatively high immigrant population, farm worker population. And there's a somewhat of a concentration of Latino Americans who live there. And they knocked on the door. A mother came to the door. She had 3 young children. They were all under the age of 3. It looked like she was pregnant. And they asked her if she would like a water filter so that they could put it on her faucet. She invites them in. She tells them that she doesn't have a water faucet. She takes them to where her kitchen sink is. And she actually has a lawn hose running through her kitchen sink under the house, underneath the house, into the house. And so the filter that they had wouldn't be adequate for that. And she wasn't fluent in English. Fortunately, they had a Spanish speaker with them. And as they were having a conversation with her, they realized that she didn't understand that, a state of emergency had been declared by the state and the feds, and that it wasn't safe to be drinking unfiltered water. And unfortunately, she and her family had been drinking the unfiltered water for the prior year and a half.
Yeah. Oh man.
So hearing stories like that, and being on the ground and seeing some of that stuff for myself just let me to know that it wasn't something that we could just swoop in and for 2 or 3 weeks, like run ads or do media interviews or, run things on our website. Like the need was just so critical there for information that we really had to deploy a heavy human resource presence where we had people on the ground, engaging the community, knocking on doors, going to events, and things of that nature, just so we could kind of do that basic level of information. And then once we kind of got the information out in the community, then really transitioning that into making sure that people were taking the appropriate steps to safeguard themselves.
Yeah. Wow. So how long do you end up being there?
So I was there about 11 months. So I got
pushing a year.
Yeah.
I knew I was missing you in DC.
Absolutely.
I knew you were off there dealing with this important situation, but didn't get to see you around the office much. So 11 months. I mean, like you
11
said,
months. Yeah,
you thought you were going for like a couple of weeks, and
I did.
you're there pushing a year. And I mean, my sense also is that because there was this breakdown in, I think, trust, the public, didn't know who they could trust, what they could trust, from their local government to the state to the feds to anybody telling them information. It wasn't something you could just go in and give some quick directions. You really had to stay there, right? I mean, is that a big part of it?
Yeah. Yeah, that was a huge part of it. I think you laid it out really well. One of the first things, we kind of worked in phases when we got there. The first thing that we really put a heavy emphasis on was, and I did this in particular, was I really went to every nonprofit and foundation that had a significant presence in Flint, and introduced myself to them, and proactively offered up ideas to them to where I thought the EPA could help from a grassroots level, got feedback from them on what they were doing, and then tried to work with them to figure out where we could kind of marry our resources and coordinate, where we weren't duplicating efforts and we were being as efficient as we could. And a big part of that was also trying to build credibility. I knew that the EPA just couldn't swoop in on our own and start like knocking on people's doors and expect there to be instant credibility, that we were going to have to like partner with organizations that were already on the ground, that were already respected and like had the influence that we were working against. Like that was really phase one. And I think it goes to your point of the fact that we just needed to, really establish a level of trust. And so, we really spent the first 4 to 8 weeks doing that. And then I would say the middle 4 to 6 months was just really just us implementing a massive, on the ground canvassing campaign. The way we would do it, we came up with a list of, I want to say it was 541 locations throughout the city that we would canvass.
That's a pretty precise number for you to remember. I want to think it was about 541, not about 550. It's like 541. I think you got it in your head, man.
Yeah, brother. I tell you, I probably still have the Excel spreadsheet too on my computer. And it was funny when we first built the list out. It was like a list of 25 locations, and of course, as you're going in the community, you're talking to people and they're saying, oh, well, you should, check out this church, or you should check out this beauty salon, or you should, go to this community center, or you should go to this retirement facility. And so literally in a matter of less than a month, we probably built that list out from 30 locations to over 500. And what we would do was we would do 2 different canvassing campaigns throughout the week. So every Tuesday through Thursday, what we would do, a group of us about, I see at our peak, there was probably, 30 to 40 federal workers on the ground who were just devoted exclusively to doing outreach in the community. And we would just drive in our cars to those 541 locations, talk to folks, make sure they had the information they need, but also kind of use it as a point to also get a pulse on where the community was at that time, just so we could make sure that our outreach efforts and our messaging was being adapted and evolving to meet the community's need. And so we would kind of do that in the middle of the week, and we'd do that Tuesdays through Thursdays, and then we would spend our Saturdays and Sundays partnering with other organizations for their canvassing efforts. So, we would go out with different church organizations, different community organizations, and we would essentially pair up. It'd be someone from the community with someone from the federal government, and they would just, be knocking on doors and things of that nature. And most of the weekend canvases were devoted to like hitting up the hardest parts of the city. So like the north side of town from Flint, and that's the part of town I'm actually from. Has the highest concentration of poverty. It's the most blighted part of town. Unfortunately, it's the most crime-ridden part of town. And then I think throughout Flint, you have anywhere, I think it's around 20 housing projects. And most of those housing projects are concentrated on the north side. So we were really, just do that concentration of really like hitting up the most vulnerable populations on the weekends. And then we would spend that Tuesday to Thursday block canvassing other sections of the city. And so it was something that, reaped a good deal of benefits from us. We certainly went in phases with things. First, it was just making sure that people knew that drinking unfiltered water was unsafe. And then it transitioned to making sure that they knew where to get resources from. There were a lot of different water depots throughout the city, because Flint has such a high concentration of poverty. Not a lot of people know this, but last I checked, over 45% of the population in Flint lives below the poverty line. And the other 55% isn't doing, that much better. And so, it's a community where you have a lot of low income residents, and not everyone has a car or a bike or access to public transit. And so, it would be, as we were going out on our canvases for families that didn't have access to transportation, we worked with the city and the state and the feds on making sure that we could orchestrate deliveries to homes of resources for families in need. And so it kind of went from just educating, providing resources, and then it just being something to where we were also doing those checkpoints, like I said, just to kind of get a pulse on the community, just to make sure that the information and the resources that we were providing were actually meeting the community's need.
Yeah. And so you kind of went through this for that 11 months, just kind of reaching out, talking to people, getting information out there. I mean, I remember being back in DC and working feverishly on flyers and language, and simplifying language and getting translations lined up, and just kind of the materials to get out to help you all that were on the ground up there. And then I guess that 11 months came to the end in big part because the Obama administration came to an end, right? And you were there as a political appointee, so your time serving kind of was up.
That's exactly right. After the election in November of 2016, we really had to get into transition mode and working with the incoming administration on just kind of briefing them on, the work that we had done to date, our recommendations for actions that we thought that they should take moving forward, and then also working to try and facilitate introductions between the incoming administration and people on the ground. And so we had to do a pretty quick, abrupt shift after election. We would have had to have done it regardless of who won the election, but I think it was a little bit more abrupt since it was a change in party and things of that nature. There have been rumors that if Secretary Clinton had won, that I think she was going to ask a number of folks to kind of stay on board for transitional purposes. With there being a change in party, we didn't have those expectations. And so we really just wanted to try and position ourselves as best as we could to kind of help facilitate a seamless transition in between the administrations and the parties.
Yeah, sure thing. Very understandable. And so then you had to kind of, how was it for you, having to kind of walk away from your community while things weren't fixed?
Yeah, it was really painful, and it was painful on a number of levels. And I think first and foremost, I walked away with a sense of disappointment because the problem had not been fixed to that point. And so, I felt that we were leaving at a time when there was more work that needed to be done. So it was disappointing on that level. It was also hurtful because I felt like our time there, we were really making inroads. Not only were we helping to safeguard people and their health, but we were actually, because we were on the ground and because we were establishing relationships, we were figuring out other ways that we could help the city and get federal resources into the city to help them with some other longstanding issues that they have been having from an economic standpoint, been having with the education system, with their transit system, many other issues. And so it was really hurtful to like walk away as we, we're still working to make progress on that front. And then just on a personal level, I had a lot of my relatives who live there and friends, they just don't follow politics and really understand government activity that much. They really didn't understand the fact that I had to leave, that like I didn't have a choice. And so really, really, really hard, like having those conversations and telling people, because, we have a new party and a new administration coming in. We have to. That's just how it is. And so, it was multiple levels that it was really, really, really tough. So yeah, that's probably one of the toughest moments in my professional career. It was only, exacerbated by the fact that I just had, personal ties to the community as well.
Oh, for sure, for sure. A little bit of a side question. You mentioned like celebrities coming to Flint. We've seen politicians go to Flint. It's one of those cases where water is actually getting attention from these two groups of people in a way. What do you think about that? What's the value or impact, positive or negative, of having celebrities pop up to Flint? Maybe there's more negative when it's politicians popping to Flint and using. I don't know. It's just kind of, that's a really open question there. But I was wondering what you think.
Yeah, no, it's really a good question. When I was on the ground in Flint, I was always happy when a celebrity would come to town and make use of their time to give a donation, or just make use of their time to help get people's minds off of the fact that they were living through a water crisis. And so, in a lot of respects, it was really mostly positive, because folks were coming there with good intentions. They were coming there with resources, and they were coming there with the intention of really lifting people's spirits. And more specifically to your question, I think it really has elevated the conversation on just the importance that water plays in our everyday lives. We just can't function without it, whether it's, washing our hands, taking a bath, cooking, drinking it, washing our cars, watering our lawn. There are just things there are a lot of things that people take for granted about it, at least on a nationwide level. Like I said, here in Michigan, because water is such a big part of our lives, being at the epicenter of the Great Lakes and things of that nature, I think we probably have a better understanding of it here in Michigan than perhaps some other states. But I think in that regard, it really helped to elevate the conversation and bring attention to it. One thing that I think came out of it that was really a positive as well is that, Flint isn't the only, unfortunately, it's not the only major municipality or urban area in the country that's, been dealing with this issue. You have cities in the Northeast corridor, whether it's Baltimore or Newark and other cities around the country that are dealing with this issue. And so I think Flint, in a lot of ways, helped elevate the conversations in other communities. And when people hear about lead issues in Baltimore or Newark or in other areas, they understand that it's a serious issue, and it can kind of be one that's hard to really understand. But if you consume lead in your body, I mean, it can actually have fatal consequences for you. And so, I think having celebrities come and rally was actually a good thing for Flynn and the city and the residents. It was a good thing for me too, because I'll tell you, just to be honest with you, brother, when you're on the ground and you're canvassing and you're just hearing all these stories of the struggle that people are going through, it actually helped to lift my spirits when I knew celebrities were coming, and they were actually coming in a lot of ways to, supplement the work that we were doing. And so not only was it like uplifting for a lot of residents, but, it was uplifting for a lot of the federal employees who are on the ground, just really trying to assist the community as best we could.
Yeah. The people there in that community wanted their voices heard, like you said, for a year and a half, whatever. Having those celebrities come helps to get that, really shine a light on what's happening and get their voice out. I could hear that. You made some other good points I really like about the idea that Flint may have permanently raised the bar, on awareness about water issues, awareness about drinking water and how important it is and how vulnerable it is. And yeah, I know that when I was on the communications end, as Flint was happening, reporters in every city across the country wanted the data on lead levels in their local water system. And the big outlets like the Wall Street Journal wanted to know they wanted all the national data on violations of the lead rule and all of that. So it definitely horrible situation, but it did help to raise awareness and create awareness and scrutiny in all these other places, which is good. What so where do things stand now? You don't have to take me back through the whole past 3 or 4 years, but I don't know if people realize that Flint's not over.
Yeah. The crisis still goes on. I'll start with the good news. The good news is that, consistently for the last probably 2 years, maybe a little bit shorter than that, the city has been consistently testing below, I want to say it's the 15 parts per billion threshold. That essentially, sets the designation as to whether or not your water is technically safe to drink. And I think for the last several months, if not at least the last few years, the city has been testing below that threshold, which is a good sign. There's a lot of investment that's gone into improving the water infrastructure there. That's ongoing, though. It's not complete yet. So the good news is that, from a technical standpoint, the water is much safer than it was when the crisis broke out. However, there's still things happening in the city to where people are having to safeguard themselves. As part of the federal investment in Flint, the feds gave the state of Michigan millions of dollars to replace Flint's lead service lines. And that construction is ongoing. And what happens is, and it's supposed to be complete, I believe this year, I think it's slated to be complete by the summer or fall of this year.
That's always one thing that's amazed me is I'm like, man, how are all those lines not already gone out of the ground and nice new safe stuff in there, like a crisis of this magnitude, injustice of this magnitude. Like, and I know resources went in, but it still just, shocks me that it just hasn't all been gutted and done.
Yeah, there were so many complications on the front end with that. I think a few things that I remember coming to mind was, weather is always a factor here in Michigan, especially once you get past, September, October, it starts to get cold pretty quick. And so, workers out in the field are somewhat limited with that. Another thing is, and this goes to, the city losing resources at a pretty fast rate over the last few decades as the city's population was shrinking, so was their city government, and a lot of record keeping as to where those service lines were and things of that nature. It took weeks and months to kind of get that in a good place. And then the other complication that was happening is that as you're having contractors come into the city to do that work, there was a lot of resentment from residents, I think rightfully so, that, if there was going to be an economic benefit associated with the recovery, then residents should kind of have, like a first bite at that apple and have an apple opportunity to compete for those services. And so making sure that contractors that are coming in and removing those lines are actually like hiring Flint residents to do the work was another thing that kind of led to it moving at a slower pace than I think a lot of folks would have liked. But fortunately, it has been taking place over the last few years. It's not done yet. And since it isn't complete yet, people still have to safeguard themselves, because as those lines are being removed from the ground, what they're doing is they're breaking lead off, and they're still existing in the service lines. And so until the work is, complete, I don't think folks can universally say that the water is safe to drink there. Another complication in Flint is that, the housing infrastructure in the city is so old. I think the first house that I ever lived in Flint was built like in 1922. And so, you have like these older homes, they have older internal plumbing. And so even if you're fixing the water service lines in some of the homes, because the piping is so old, once the water hits the home, you're still potentially at risk. And so just making sure that folks, are using filters or replacing, the plumbing that's central to their home is another step that's having to be undertaken. And the feds have provided resources for that. And that work is ongoing. So to your point, no, the crisis isn't over.
Yeah.
There's definitely been progress, but we're coming up on celebrating the 6-year anniversary on April 25th, and if things hopefully clear up a little bit with the coronavirus outbreak, and there's an opportunity to go up there, I was going to plan on doing so. It's looking like right now I have to delay that commemorative, but in any case, it's come April 25th. I think there'll definitely be attention around the fact that we're 6 years into this and the problem isn't fully solved.
Cool. Well, Mike, I know I'm glad we caught up and that you could share a lot of this story of Flint from a different side, from someone that's from the community that spent 11 months there, as being your hometown, but as also representing EPA. It's great information. I want to do another podcast with you sometime soon to kind of dive back into the other EPA stuff we've worked on with water and outreach and everything. I think we got a whole other conversation to have there, but I appreciate it, man. Definitely. And I'm glad we caught up finally.
Absolutely, brother. Thanks for having me on. And I really appreciate you, raising awareness on not only an important issue, but, an issue that's near and dear to my heart. There's no better community in this nation than Flint, Michigan. And there's no more deserving community that deserves to have the resources for them to have a functioning water system than Flint. And so I think by raising awareness on this issue, we're serving them well and hopefully preventing something like that from happening in any other community across this nation.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, a great Flintstone, Micah Ragland right there. Thanks a lot. We'll talk soon.
Take care.
Waterloop, waterloop, waterloop.
Thank you to the sponsor of this episode, the Flume Smart Water Monitor that tracks your home's water use 24/7, alerting you to excessive water use and leaks. Use promo code WATERLOOP now for 15% off at flumetech.com.
You're in the water loop.
Waterloop, waterloop, waterloop.